Illiterate Manga Club.
Hey yo, welcome back to Illiterate Manga Club. It's your boy, Zombie Nick. And today I wanted to talk about kind of an interesting case study when it comes to failed or cancelled manga. And that is, of course, Zombie Powder by Tite Kubo. This is his first manga that was serialized in Shonen Jump. He had made a couple of one-shots beforehand, but this was his first proper series that was in the magazine. I'm actually planning a Bleach retrospective, and I figured this would make for sort of an interesting kind of episode 0. Since you can glean a lot from Kubo's sort of early approach to making manga, you can definitely see a lot of similarities between Zombie Powder and Bleach. And I think understanding Zombie Powder is a good way to figure out why Bleach ended up being more successful. Not just more successful, one of the most successful manga ever made, in fact. Zombie Powder has a pretty simple story. It revolves around a group of characters trying to find the Rings of the Dead, a set of 12 rings which put together will create the Zombie Powder, a substance which gives the owner eternal life. I'd go into more detail, but that's really kind of it. That's basically the main motivating goal for the entire story. It's basically this group of ragtag characters all trying to get their hands on the Rings of the Dead. You know, it's your pretty classic sort of collect the objects kind of story, akin to Dragon Ball. Our main character is Gamma, who, imagine like what a little 11-year-old boy would think is the coolest character ever, and that's basically Gamma. Gamma has a very strong sort of, like late 90s, early 2000s sort of edgy protagonist kind of energy. You know, Gamma is cool because he's like a wanted criminal. Like, let me just read you verbatim this one panel to kind of get an idea of what this guy is like and some of the sort of mentality that went into designing him. He's an S0 level criminal, Gamma Akutabi. This psycho has black armor grafted onto his right arm. That's why his alias is the Black-Armed Shinigami, the Black-Armed Death God. His bounty is 960 million. And he fights with a chainsaw sword. Later on, we learn that his real power is that he can make black fire and turn it into weapons. So, you probably get the idea of what I'm talking about. This is definitely a very sort of power fantasy, sort of, you know, idea of a cool character that kind of came from that era. Like, he is definitely that dude. And I think he's like a fine protagonist. I think Kubo definitely kind of prioritized him being cool over being relatable. He, of course, has a younger sidekick to try to get that, like, youth appeal. You know, the Batman and Robin strategy. Elwood is not particularly remarkable. He is definitely the sort of archetypal, young, inexperienced guy who kind of looks up to the protagonist, who has a lot of doubts about his own abilities and his kind of usefulness in the group. You know, he's unfortunately the kind of character where your sort of first instinct about him is also correct. He doesn't really do anything out of the ordinary, anything that kind of surprise you. He has at least one fairly decent fight throughout the series, so he's not just like a bum like some of these characters kind of end up being. So a lot of the time, he's kind of just there and more so serves as almost like a distraction to sidetrack from fights that could have happened between these theoretically cooler characters. And speaking of cool characters, definitely my favorite is Mr. Smith. Similar to Gamma, he's another dangerous, wanted criminal, but he's similarly cool. Like, he fights with guns. Also, he wears a suit, and that's cool. Characters who wear suits are cool. The last sort of main character to join the group is Wolfina. Her tits are huge! I mean, she has one of the more interesting backstories in the series, although to be fair, we really learn almost nothing about Smith and Gamma's backstories. But either way, she's interesting. She's a journalist who works towards taking down criminal organizations. And she also fights with like a camera's tripod, which is pretty funny. But yeah, it's a perfectly serviceable crew, but I think that's honestly part of the problem is that these guys are just very, very okay. Elwood and Gamma especially definitely feel very stereotypical. Like I said, Smith is definitely my favorite, but I also wouldn't say he's like one of the most unique characters ever created. But he's at least a little different compared to Gamma and Elwood, so I think that's why I gravitated towards him. So even though I thought that the actual characters were fine, I think one thing that I was sort of let down by was the actual setting. Zombie Powder is a Western, sorta. In the first, like, 1, 2, maybe 3 chapters, you definitely sort of get the vibe that this is more so designed to take place kind of in the bum-ass nowhere, not necessarily like the real North American West, but a sort of conceptually similar setting. To be honest, the more time that we spent in the story, the more I kind of forgot that was even the original intention. And over time, it stops feeling like a Western and more so kind of just becomes like a place. If the attempt was to make the story seem like a Western, I don't think Kubo did a very good job because none of the characters' designs really reflect that at all. And I'm not saying everybody needs to be walking around in a fucking cowboy hat and boots, but I think the setting ended up neither being sort of realistic enough nor fantastical enough to be interesting. And in fact, the only sort of like unique fantastical element that's in the story is the existence of the Rings of the Dead and the zombie powder. And I guess like Gamma's cool black fire. And I think the story sort of just suffers from a lack of interesting locations or history or anything. This is just not a setting that I'm all that interested in exploring. And I think that's part of why it didn't end up lasting all that long, since unless you're really into the characters or the action, there just really wasn't a lot to keep you coming back. What is good though is the art, which definitely feels very early Kubo. If you compare it to the first couple of chapters of Bleach, for example, you can definitely see the similarity, especially in terms of how he draws characters' faces and action scenes. It's definitely not as refined as Bleach, but you can for sure tell it's the same guy, just a slightly less experienced version of him. One thing that I think Kubo for sure improved at going from Zombie Powder to Bleach are his actual character designs. I think Bleach has some of the coolest character designs ever put into manga, and in comparison, Zombie Powder kinda just, doesn't. Gamma looks pretty cool. He's got his, like, long white hair, that metal thing on his head, his chainsaw sword. Gamma is for sure the most recognizable character from this. But otherwise, most of the characters just aren't really all that visually interesting. Smith, for example, is kinda just a guy in a suit. Elwood is kinda just a kid. Although the story never really had a chance to establish a main villain, the character they spend the most time fighting is kinda just a circus ringmaster sort of guy in a top hat. So yeah, unfortunately there's definitely a lack of standout character designs. And I think that's probably the biggest problem with Zombie Powder overall, it's just the fact that it's all just really okay. Even though I would say that Kubo does draw some pretty cool action scenes in the manga, they're not really particularly interesting fights. Many of them are just Gamma being the strongest guy ever. And the main cast also really don't have any interesting abilities. Smith kinda just fights with guns, Elwood throws knives, Wolfina hits people with a tripod. Gamma definitely has the coolest power set, but even then, whenever I finished reading one of the battles that took place, I didn't really stop and think, wow, that was a good fight. Instead, I kinda just thought, oh, that was cool. The manga also ends rather unceremoniously. There's a kinda sorta goodbye chapter, but not really. Just enough to where you could vaguely kinda sorta fill in the blanks on your own about what happens, but otherwise, yeah, there's not really a conclusion, so to speak. The manga had a run consisting from August 2nd, 1999 to February 28th of 2000, so it's pretty safe to say that this one didn't really garner too much of an audience, and as such was sort of kicked out of the magazine. So why did Zombie Powder fail? Honestly, I think Zombie Powder's biggest problem is just the fact that it's really okay, and features a lot of elements that feel kind of been there, done that. The actual quest for the Rings of the Dead isn't very engaging. The setting kind of feels like an afterthought. The fights are decent, but they're not really anything special. And it has a group of characters which are fine, but maybe not particularly unique. And I also think, now this one is getting a little bit more sort of speculative, but I think the Zombie Powder we got may have been a slightly corrupted version of Kubo's original vision. For example, we get to see Gamma's original concept design and some author commentary. In it, he says, "You may have been able to guess from his overall look that Gamma's initial concept was that of a samurai. At that stage, the comic was called Samurai Draw, and not only were there no Rings of the Dead, it wasn't even a Western. The only thing that the story had in common with the final version is that Gamma had a huge bounty on his head. After that, a lot of stuff happened, and I ended up with a Western theme, but that's a different story altogether." So just based on that, at least to me, it seems like Zombie Powder's initial concept was a lot more similar to Bleach. Him originally planning Gamma to be a samurai is obviously the biggest giveaway, but one line that really stuck with me is, "After that, a lot of stuff happened and I ended up with a Western theme." This is entirely speculative, and I don't know if Kubo has ever made any kind of statement about this. And maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but I kind of feel like Zombie Powder was sort of perverted by whoever Kubo's editor was at the time. Kubo would later say in an interview in 2012 that he paid too much attention to his editor's comments during the making of Zombie Powder. So this sort of leads me to believe that the Western idea was actually the editor's concept, since in Kubo's original vision it wasn't meant to be a Western, and the actual manga in the grand scheme of things features very few Western elements. It feels like something that's tacked on. Personally, Personally, I'm of the belief that a lot of stuff that happened was some sort of meeting went down between Kubo and his editor, and the editor saying that it would be a more original story if it were a Western, despite the fact that wasn't really what Kubo wanted to make, and that's sort of what ended up happening with Zombie Powder. Like I said, I don't really have any evidence of this isn't something that Kubo has ever stated, but at least to me, based on the statements that he's made, it feels like the pieces sort of fall into place on this. So even though Zombie Powder wasn't Kubo's original concept, and it didn't really end up proving to be all that successful, I think you could definitely tell that he learned a lot of lessons from this manga. Since I think pretty much all of my major issues with Zombie Powder would end up being fixed in Bleach. Ichigo, for example, is a much more relatable protagonist. It has a lot more substance than just, he's cool. It has a much more original setting and concepts. Characters have more interesting abilities, especially the longer you get into the series. Characters are much more visually interesting. The actual fights are a lot better. And even though Bleach is far from perfect, I'd say it's a definite improvement over Zombie Powder. It feels like Kubo really took this manga's failure to heart and created something that really improved upon its predecessor. Luckily, his interest in Big Badonkadonk seems to have never changed, so that's good. So yeah, Zombie Powder is interesting, not the actual story itself. The actual manga is fairly uninteresting, but I think as a sort of time capsule in this author's career and as almost like a point of reference, it's genuinely really interesting to go back and look at. This feels like a younger, less experienced Kubo is making this. And it's really cool to see what's similar and what's different. A lot of the essence of what made Kubo's manga stand out is definitely here, like the over-the-top action, as well as his art style are here, but it's definitely missing a lot of the elements that are just as, if not more important, like having an interesting setting, a story that you want to keep reading week to week, as well as some more interesting characters. I'd say if you're curious, it's worth checking out. It's available on the Shonen Jump app. Like I said, there's only 26 chapters. But I'd say this one kind of more falls into the curiosity piece sort of category. It's probably not going to rock your world or anything, but it'll definitely help you get some new perspective on Kubo as an author. And the obscure little gem that he would make after this, a little sleeper hit, I don't think you've heard of it, it's called Bleach. You know, it sold 130 million volumes. But yeah, the first episode of my Bleach retrospective should come out probably in the next couple of weeks, I'd say. I'm looking forward to really talking about it in depth. Bleach is like actually one of my favorite series ever. And I've got a lot to say about it, so, you know, that'll probably be a retrospective that's going on for a while. But yeah, thank you for joining me on another Illiterate Manga Club. I'll see you guys next time.